Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Psychedelic Vantage. Today, Adam and I have the pleasure of speaking with Florian Brand and Dr. Srinivas Rao, co-CEOs and co-founders of ATAI Life Sciences. ATAI is a mental health-focused clinical stage biopharmaceutical company with the objective of enabling patients to achieve clinically meaningful improvements by developing innovative therapeutics with rapid onset, durable effects, and a focus on interventional treatment approaches. The goal of this interview is to learn more about clinical trial design in the psychedelic medicine space, the difference between psychological support and psychotherapy, and of course, with ATAI having the largest and most diverse portfolio of clinical stage psychedelic candidates in the space, we are really looking forward to learning more about the company's pipeline programs. It has been a busy year for ATAI, from announcing their strategic investment in Beckley Psytech to accelerate the development of short-duration psychedelic drug candidates, to announcing very exciting developments with VLS-01 and EMP-01 most recently. Florian, Srini, thank you both for coming on the channel today. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah.
And thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us on. Yeah.
Very excited for this one. Thank you for coming on again. So before we dive in, for maybe new viewers, can you share about how the company got started and give a brief overview of how ATAI plans to achieve its mission to help those suffering with mental health disorders and addiction?
Yeah, very happy to jump in. As you might know, ATAI is kind of a very mission-driven company that was started really with the desire to make a true impact for mental health patients, and that is really rooted in many of the founders seeing actually friends and family members developing severe mental health conditions and not finding really the support, help, and healing that they needed to improve or in a very sustainable way. So that was driving us actually to start this company to have a really meaningful impact for those that are suffering and not finding the appropriate help for their suffering. And then to your, I guess, second part of your question is the way that we are going about this, so the way that we are doing this. So we're really interested in true innovative things in the mental health space. We have started out as a hub and spoke model with kind of you mentioned the diversity, kind of large portfolio in psychedelics. And more recently, you mentioned also the investment in Beckley Psytech have more and more focus on this 2-hour in the clinic short duration paradigm that more recently also got some good press, if you want, with the Spravato sales numbers that is now, this drug from J&J is now on a run rate annualized. If you basically extrapolate from the quarterly sales that they reported out last time of 1.1 billion, so that's very encouraging. That from a commercial standpoint, also there are more than 4,500 clinics that have been that underwent the REMS program for Spravato, so there's a critical infrastructure in place. So that together and kind of our excitement around BPL-003 and ELE-101, the two compounds that Beckley developed, led us then also to the decision to more focus in from a pipeline perspective or program perspective in the depression space on that short duration paradigm. In general, next to depression, also looking at addiction, so opioid use disorder, as well as social anxiety disorder. There we announced a trial design and kind of a timeline very recently, and I bet Srini is going to go into that a bit more in detail. And then we have also a phase 2b program going on, a non-psychedelic one, in cognitive impairment associated with schizophrenia. So very diverse setup, very excited about each individual program, and very much also excited about the entirety of that pipeline. And very much looking forward to the next 12, 18 months as we have a lot of catalysts coming up.
Thank you so much for that overview, Florian. And it's definitely been a lot of exciting updates from ATAI this year. Very exciting. So with the recent news of the FDA issuing a complete response letter to Lykos Therapeutics requesting an additional phase 3 study for MDMA-assisted therapy for the treatment of PTSD, we thought it would make sense to start with questions about clinical trial design in the psychedelic medicine space. So along with ATAI's promising internal psychedelic program set to enter into later stages of development, The company owns significant minority stakes in two late-stage companies in the space, Compass Pathways, who's working with COMP360 psilocybin, and Beckley Psytech, whose lead candidate is intranasal 5-MeO DMT. Can you please share to the viewers about the clinical trial design that Compass Pathways is using for their phase 3 program and that Beckley Psytech is using for their phase 2b trial? How is it different from the trials that were run by Lykos?
Yeah, so there were quite a few differences, right? And I think, and if you even go a step further back in time, you know, think about Spravato as well, there were some pretty significant differences between all of these different trial designs and what Lykos ultimately ended up doing. So big picture, there's a couple of things you really need to nail, right? So you need to get some degree of durability data, and you need that to be double-blind, placebo-controlled durability data, ideally. Then potentially with an open label extension beyond that. And you need to get some dose ranging, right? I think that's really important. And then of course we'll talk a little bit about the whole therapist thing and some of the functional unblinding questions that come up, but around the therapist. But why you need these data, the durability and the dose response, is to get past functional unblinding within the patient, which is nothing new, right? So lots of drugs do this. It is not unique to psychedelics. One could argue it's more pronounced as psychedelics, certainly. But if you think about some of the other approvals, like gamma hydroxybutyrate was approved for narcolepsy. Well, it's pretty functionally unblinding. Even some of the SSRIs tend to be quite functionally unblinding, but the way you do it is you look for persistence of benefit, and you look for this. You look for a dose response. So there may be a place where you still have a psychedelic effect, but you're not seeing the same degree of efficacy. So Compass did a nice job with that, as you know, in their phase 2b trial. They encompassed all of these pieces, right? So they had 3 doses. Well, they had the functional placebo of 1 milligrams, but then they did 10 and 25. 10 and 25 were quite psychedelic, both of them. But you did see better efficacy with the 25. Okay. And then they followed it out for 12 weeks. So BPL-003, the phase 2b trial, is similar to that. And then, recently we announced the phase 2 design for VLS-01. So we're in the fortunate position to obviously, particularly with BPL-003, have a lot of visibility and insight into those studies. That gave us the latitude to answer a different question with our trial, and that is what happens with repeat doses, right? So it's a slightly different question. It will be beneficial for both programs if we understand that. Clearly different compounds, but still. So again, just to backtrack a little bit, BPL-003 is an intranasal transmucosal formulation of 5-methoxy-DMT. VLS-01 is a buccal strip. It's something you put, like a Listerine strip you put on your cheek surfaces, gets absorbed that way. It's DMT. So again, we had the latitude to answer a different set of questions. So we are doing, getting the durability, the core durability. We're testing it. We're dosing twice. So placebo, true placebo, or the dose we're proceeding with, which is 120. Dose them twice, get a sense of differential response with the second dose, then looking at durability out to 12 weeks, then redosing with either 60 or 120, and then following them out for an additional 2 weeks. So we'll have good data on durability. We'll also have good data on dose response through the conduct of the study.
Awesome. Thank you for the overview, Srini. And I would like to ask with, I believe the AdCom meeting for esketamine Spravato was in 2019. I was curious if maybe you and the team at ATAI maybe looked back to that meeting. Was functional unblinding a huge topic of discussion like it was with for MDMA?
It was brought up, but it wasn't a huge topic.
Okay.
I think that's the important bit, because the trials were conducted in a fashion that was maybe more, what they were accustomed to, what the AdCom was accustomed to seeing, what the agency was accustomed to seeing. Fundamentally, how Lykos's product was positioned as MDMA assisted therapy, putting it secondary to therapy, is inherently problematic as far as the FDA is concerned. Now, notwithstanding the whole special protocol assessment and everything else, but still, that's an odd construction for a new product that's going in. I mean, there are some ways to do it, but you have to do it on top of standard of care therapy, and then you can sort of get away with it, right? So if you think about the buprenorphine formulations for opioid use disorder, you do that on top of therapy, but there's a standard therapy here. So here, unfortunately, it was two new variables, two potential actives, one of which wasn't that well defined. And I think that definitely caused some degree of consternation, as indicated by the AdCom. They were concerned about the variability in the therapy. That was something that was brought up.
So now I would like to ask now about the difference between psychological support, which is, I believe, being used in Compass's trial, Beckley's trial, and we'll also ask about VLS-01 as well. And psychotherapy, the difference between that and psychotherapy, which was used in the MDMA trial. So the way I've been trying to think about it, and I am just a little bit confused, but I'm starting to get more clarity on it. So while preparation and dosing sessions seem to definitely not be psychotherapy, with preparation, from my understanding, being mostly about giving informed consent and, maybe explaining what a patient might experience before dosing, and the actual session itself, due to the nature of high doses of classical psychedelics, not much talking going on.
Right.
So with that said, how would integration sessions not be considered psychotherapy? That's been my biggest question.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So yeah, you nailed it in terms of preparation. It's an unusual experience, right? For individuals that have not taken any kind of psychedelic in advance in their past, and that is the target population that we're looking at, right? So really looking for people that have not used much, if anything, and we were talking about two in the entirety of their life. So two exposures. So it is an unusual experience. You do need to make sure that the patient is in a good mindset. If they're really scared going into it, that's not necessarily going to be the best thing for them, right? If you're really fearful about the experience, that's going to manifest in some way during the experience and may make for a more, challenging experience. We don't necessarily want that. So absolutely right. You nailed it in terms of what's occurring during the experience. MDMA, there's a hypothesis that there's still a therapeutic element that could be done. It is non-directive, even with MAPS. It's really, if you think about MDMA, it tends to be more externally focused, which is why it's a drug of abuse, right? That's why you use it at raves and things like that. In the case of classical psychedelics, it's much more internal. And so there is not this requirement. Now, integration is an interesting one, and you can use different terms for it. I mean, essentially what we want to ensure is psychological safety for the patient, right? That's the most important thing. So there will be things that came up, and they may be very challenging things that come up, right? So some history of past abuse would be an obvious one. That person is likely going to need some help and going to need some support, right? So making sure they're plugged in with a therapist at that point that is independent of the drug, right? That can help support that patient with what came up is important.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that explanation there, Srini. Adam, I am going to pass it off to you for viewers to learn more about ATAI's pipeline, recent data released from the company, and also upcoming milestones.
All right. Thank you very much, Jake. So to get things going, since we had both of you on the channel last year, ATAI announced in January of this year that it made a significant strategic investment in Beckley SciTech. Can you explain to the viewers the terms of the deal and what you both saw in Beckley to cause you to make this investment?
Sure. If you basically look at our pipeline, we have multiple assets in depression. We're very excited, and Srini is going to go into this in a little while, I'm sure, about our VLS-01 asset, our DMT asset. And that very much fits into kind of that short duration paradigm that we already addressed earlier. BPL-003 also fits into that paradigm very nicely, so does ELE-101. And that's kind of that short duration paradigm we believe is, if you look kind of at the second generation compounds that are in development, where basically you tweak the formulation to optimize for scalability, convenience, and accessibility for patients, is something that is truly exciting for us, without kind of downplaying what Compass is doing at psilocybin. But it's just an evolution of the space, especially combined with the Spravato sales numbers that is really intriguing, and was kind of one of the key drivers for that deal to happen from a, I guess, molecular scientific clinical databases. It's also quite complementary to our perspective. So it's pharmacologically, 5-MeO-DMT is pharmacologically different from our DMT asset. So is psilocin, that's the ELE-101 asset. So we feel very good about kind of this diversified approach when we look at depression. And when it comes to deal terms, we at the time acquired 35.5% of Beckley. We also secured as a 1-to-1 warrant coverage that gets us even further, closer to 50%. And we have a ROFR and ROFR structure in place that if you continue kind of to like the data that is coming out, we could more closely collaborate by triggering those rights that we have in place. So that kind of makes us feel good about the risk reward profile that we have with that investment, and also put the team that we're very much enthusiastic about at Beckley very much in the position to focus on execution of the ongoing trials. At the time of the investment, they had multiple trials ongoing, so we didn't want to rock the boat and feel very good about the structure that we decided to put in place to onboard them to our portfolio.
Thank you for the overview. And correct me if I'm wrong, isn't I believe the chief scientific officer of Beckley, Rob Conley, he was the chief of neuroscience at Eli Lilly?
Yeah, he was. Yeah. Got a little bit of more than a passing familiarity with the space.
Yeah.
And really it shows in the trials, it shows in the execution, etc. So again, very strong team.
That's awesome. Adam.
Can you guys speak about the recent phase 2A trial results that were released with BPL-3, Beckley's intranasal 5-MeO-DMT candidate looking at TRD, and the phase 1 trial results of ELE-101, Beckley's IV psilocin candidate? How do these results strengthen ATAI's view on the promise of these programs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as Florian indicated, I mean, our focus has been this short duration, treatment for treatment-resistant depression. By pulling these in, of course, we basically have the 3 most advanced assets that are all in that 2-hour window, and that's what got us excited. One of the things around 5-methoxy-DMT, unlike DMT, is that there is no double-blind placebo-controlled data around its use in depression, right? So and that was one of the reasons that back in the day we went after DMT. Now, there's been more data that's come out over time that's increased our confidence, and the phase 2A results are one of those data sets, right? So it's 11 subjects, it's open label, so the important caveats nonetheless. But going back to what I said at the outset, durability is important, right? So we saw an acute effect that was really quite robust with a short administration of the compound. So this isn't a 2 hours-ish kind of psychedelic experience. And then basically they had an acute effect that was present. I mean, a robust effect that was present at 4 weeks, as well as at 12 weeks. And that last bit is really the important one. So they had this durability, essentially that sort of 50% response and remission rates that persisted all the way through. So that's what got us really excited by these data. It increased our conviction, increased pretest probabilities of the phase 2B trial, essentially. So this is a 10 milligram dose. The phase 2B is looking at is sort of splitting the difference, 8 and 12, but again, increases our conviction around those data.
So Srini, like you said, the phase 2A, it was a small open label trial, but what got me really excited is that, I think this data came out in 2021 at this point, from GH Research with their 5-MeO program, inhalation. Maybe we could talk about the differences there. We only got, I believe, data out to 7 days. So yes. I was very excited when this open label data came out to see efficacy out to 3 months. And that was very exciting, and really looking forward to more of the Beckley results as well, and all the programs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the most important thing. So short duration with an open label is a little hard to interpret, right? Because, you maximize functional unblinding, of course. I mean, everybody knows they got the drug, et cetera, it's open label. but these are folks with treatment-resistant depression. So, you know, the initial buzz will wear off, if you will, and you'd anticipate kind of reversion. And here we didn't see that. And I think that was really important. So that's exactly it. That's what got us excited about this.
Absolutely.
And Adam, you'd also mentioned ELE 101. So interestingly enough, so just back, you know, in terms of backstory. So if you give someone psilocybin orally, you don't see psilocybin in the blood. You see psilocin. Okay, so psilocybin is the prodrug of psilocin. So we all know that orally administering psilocybin results in a 4, 5, 6 hour psychedelic effect. Interestingly enough, when you give ELE 101, when you give psilocin rather intravenously, it's a much shorter experience, and that's what made it interesting, and that's what prompted Beckley to go down this road. And essentially, the phase 1 trial confirmed the short duration of effect. That's the important thing to think about. So unlike, it's the same moiety as psilocybin, so it's de-risked from an efficacy perspective, but it's shorter duration. So it's a really interesting compound in that regard. It's intravenous administration at the moment. There's some potential opportunities there to tweak that if we wanted to, going down, further down the road, but nonetheless, very good tolerability, good robust psychedelic effects, good PK in terms of where one wants to be to look at the psychedelic effects, going back to psilocybin. So again, very nice product. Looking forward to some 2A data there as well.
How much shorter, how much time are you guys actually taking off compared to psilocybin, for example?
Yeah, this is around 2 hours. So it's pretty substantially shorter. I mean, the very shortest case with psilocybin is on the order of 4 hours. I mean, realistically, it's, so think of it as an all-day experience, right? This is substantially shorter, more, it's certainly in line with BPL-003 as well as VLS-01.
Jake, you mentioned inhaled 5-MeO, and I think just one thought there, and Srini, I'll welcome you, of course, to chime in there as well, is we didn't like inhaled 5-MeO. So we looked at 5-MeO very early on. We didn't like the very spiky PK profile that you see with an inhaled formulation of 5-MeO. So the intranasal formulation is much more gentle, if you want. So you don't get that rapid Cmax that you see with an inhaled formulation, and not that dissimilar from our thinking around BLS, which is also quite gentle. So if you compare the two PK and PD curves, that is sort of what we believe is actually quite a good, a good profile of a drug going into the efficacy trials.
And yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I got experience through a previous company with inhaled. As a general statement, the FDA doesn't love things that go into the lung, and they look for a lot of safety data around that. We're aware, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, I think GH is still on clinical hold, pending the generations of preclinical data around lung toxicity. I think that was what was formally guided, publicly guided. That didn't shock me. And, again, that was one of the reasons that I wasn't a big fan of doing anything inhaled.
And I also would like to ask, I haven't heard it spoken about that much, but at least when I looked through the phase 1 trial that GH Research ran, I did see flashbacks as an adverse event. I'm not too sure how much of a problem this is. But I would like to ask, do you believe your in the intranasal formulation of 5-MeO does it have the potential to not have that issue, if it even is a big issue? I'm not too sure, so I would like to know. Yeah,
I think we're going to need more data on that. I mean, there wasn't much of a signal here. The doses are interestingly a lot lower here, right? So, the top dose is 12 milligrams, and it's transmucosal, versus inhaled 18 milligrams, I believe, is the top dose of GH. So it's a substantially lower dose. And unclear what's happening, so on the upswing, you're kind of snowed, right? I mean, as that hits your brain, you're going to be pretty out of it. But then on the downswing, what's happening there is not entirely clear. But you're certainly going through very high concentrations, and they're coming down at the same rate that it's going down with transmucosal. So I don't know. I mean, is it a dose phenomenon? I think in both cases, we really need to understand that a little bit better with some larger data sets, in all fairness.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
ATAI recently announced that the company is planning to advance VLS-1 and EMP-1 into phase 2 programs at around year end. Can you share to the viewers about what makes you excited regarding these programs and how they differentiated from other psychedelic compounds in clinical development?
Yeah, so I mean, we started with the LSO1 in roughly the 2020 timeframe. And the idea, even at the very outset, again, was to hit that 2 hour window, but also to have something that is patient friendly and doctor friendly. So specifically didn't want anything that was parenteral, in that case, nothing with a needle, essentially. And even looking at other routes of administration like intranasal, et cetera, we thought if we can pull this off, so to speak, with the oral transmucosal film, that will be the best, tolerated, the best, because people are comfortable with oral administration. And this is basically like a Listerine strip. It's relatively straightforward for the patient to take. What I can say is that, this is a complex formulation. These are not easy to do. And we had a prototype formulation. We talked about those phase 1 results roughly a year ago, maybe a little bit less. And we got good absorption. We got some more variability because it was a prototype formulation. There was a lot of piecing it together, but we learned a lot. And then we were able to put together a really nice formulation that we're comfortable moving into phase 2. That's what we tested in this most recent phase 1 trial. And it exceeded expectations. I mean, I think that's the best way to put it. So we looked up at 120, 160 at the higher doses. We actually believe the 160 dose is probably a little too high. And it's nice to have that kind of margin, right? So what we found is the 120 milligram dose is a really nice, splitting the difference, if you will, robust psychedelic effects, very good tolerability, has the potential to be best in class. Again, it's oral administration. No, people had no issues. There was no local tolerability concerns. Good PK profile. So, there's only with the 120 milligram dose, there was one instance of nausea as an adverse event, and there was no vomiting, right? So that's different than other, compounds in this class. And this was a good end. I mean, we had about 14 subjects. It wasn't the usual, like 6 subject kind of thing. So we were very encouraged by those results. Headache was generally a little lower than others. So, in totality, oral, no local effects, no limited nausea, no vomiting, et cetera. If this gets borne out in larger studies, has the potential to be best in class. That's what gets us really excited about this.
With VLS-1, the transmucosal film, how long do patients have to keep it in their mouth for? And with the taste masking, have you guys found that you've been able to mask it like significantly? Because I can imagine DMT tasting very well, or very good.
Yeah, no, it's bitter. Yeah, so it absorbs by itself. It's gone in about 20 minutes or so, 20, 30 minutes, I believe. So it's a thin film. It's not like it's particularly, it's not, there are some thicker films that are designed to be taken back out. This is not that. So this is something that gets absorbed. There is a backing layer that prevents the compound from leaking out into the oral cavity, so you don't taste it. And there's taste on that backing layer. And so it really does prevent, that kind of bitter taste. We did a really nice job with that. I mean, there's some bitter taste, but people were very tolerant of it. It's mostly, what was the flavor? I think it was like cherry. No, I don't remember. Or it's lime or something. I don't even remember. But people generally liked it. There was no complaints about that. So we're very happy with how that worked out.
And Srini, I was very interested to see with VLS-01 looking in the blinded portion of the trial, looking at the VLS-01 2 weeks apart with the dosing. The reason I thought it was really interesting is because Compass, they're looking at dosing 3 weeks apart. So I was wondering, why 2 weeks apart? Why not 3?
Yeah, I mean, we considered 3. We considered, this got us to a couple of things. So it's 2 doses to an endpoint of 4 weeks, right? If you think about going back to Spravato for a moment, their acute trial had a 4-week endpoint, but we actually have something called a key secondary at 6 weeks. So if we hit at 4 weeks, we can do the comparison at 6 weeks. If we hit there, that actually means we're statistically significant at 6 weeks. So we've got the entirety. So now you're 2 weeks or 4 weeks past the second dose, which is nice. So that was kind of the thought process of how we came together, put that together. 3 week didn't quite work out quite as well. So that'd be only 1 week up to the last dose. So this was kind of nice. Again, fits in with what Spravato did. 4 weeks is a regulatory endpoint. We know obviously what Compass's trials look like. They have a 6-week endpoint, totally fine. We will be able to really understand that as well, because we will have that as a formal endpoint in our trial.
I see. And yeah, would you like to touch on EMP-01? I was really fascinated to hear you speak about this compound. It seems very unique. Would you like to touch on it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's again really interesting. It's another data set that was very exciting. The results were very exciting. So backstory here, MDMA is a so-called racemic mixture, and that means there's two separate molecules in it. They have the same structure. They're kind of like your hands. They are mirror images. They don't superimpose, right? So, and just like your hands, if you try and take your right hand, shove it in your left glove, you're not going to be that successful with it, right? So that's how they bind. In this context, in that analogy, the receptor is the glove. So they have different pharmacologies as general rule, racemic mixtures. Sometimes one of them is inert. In the case of MDMA, our SMDMA is actually very much a stimulant. It acts a lot like amphetamine, so it causes the release of dopamine. It causes the release of norepinephrine. RMDMA has a much more 5-HT focused activity. So the initial hypothesis was that you could probably get a better therapeutic index by going with just RMDMA. In other words, you could preserve most of the traditional entactogenic effects of MDMA, but have less influence or less impact on the heart and other aspects, right? So like the bruxism, the grinding of the teeth, and there's also this hyperthermia that basically a fever that you get with that because your muscles are kind of tense. So all of these things we thought we might be able to improve on, and that's important because PTSD populations do in fact have more cardiovascular risk factors, right? So that was the initial hypothesis. So we went into the phase 1. We were obviously able to get to very high doses of our MDMA. So if you think about MDMA, it's right around 150 milligrams is the dose. That means you're getting 75 milligrams of SMDMA and 75 milligrams of RMDMA. In a medical setting, that was sort of the upper dose, that was a higher tolerability limit because you start getting some of these other effects when you go beyond that. Here we were able to go up to 225 milligrams of RMDMA, which would be equivalent of 450 of the racemate, which of course is kind of a non-trivial dose. But what we found is a very nice dose response on different things. That's what you really like to see in a smaller study. That's what gives you confidence what you're seeing is quote unquote real. So we found, emotional breakthroughs. There's a beautiful dose response. We know that it's something called the emotional breakthrough inventory. Emotional breakthrough is an important mediator of antidepressant effects with psilocybin, but thought to be important in other indications as well, including in anxiety indications. We also found that it was very psychedelic-like in nature. So it had these features that were very much in keeping with an MDMA type product, but it also had psychedelic-like things. So we did something called the 5D-ASC, which is pretty, a lot of people do use that. There's ego dissolution measures, there's dread of ego there's basically aware, oneness kind of measures, as well as anxiety measures, et cetera, in there. Oceanic boundlessness is the first one. We found that it actually looked a lot like psilocybin, but not quite. So it's somewhere in between MDMA and psilocybin. Interestingly, there were visual phenomena that occurred, but they weren't normal visual phenomena that you see with psilocybin or VLS for that matter. Rather, they were being able to visualize your life differently. So it's a sort of a level up from normal kind of visual hallucination. So really an interesting profile. The people that were watching the subjects were in many situations had seen MDMA being used. They were in many cases, I think they were either all or the majority were previously had experience with the MAP studies. They said it was a very different experience than MDMA. MDMA again is externally facing. This was very much internally facing. And the healthy volunteers, and it's important to emphasize that, came out of it saying that this was a remarkable experience that was really meaningful to them. So we spent some time thinking about it. Where could this be used? Certainly PTSD is on the table as an indication, but we also looked a bit more broadly than that. And came upon social anxiety disorder. Now, of course, social anxiety disorder has always been known, but there are some approvals for it, but they're 2 decades old at this point. Definitely came to the fore in terms of awareness during COVID, because a lot of particularly children, but even adults, had exacerbation of social anxiety when they were all kind of sequestered and then had to go meet people in real life. So it's kind of gotten more press over the last couple of years. It's something that's going to be sticking around, particularly for those younger individuals. And I have kids that were in high school during that time, and it was very impactful, and it has long-term effects, persistent effects. So I think it's unfortunately going to be something that does persist. It is very impactful to the patients. They tend to avoid social interactions. That obviously is not good for your psyche, right? That's one of the things that does drive happiness. It does drive, meaningfulness in people, is having good social networks and social interactions. So it is really quite impactful. Current therapies, I mean, again, it's kind of like depression was 10 years ago. We know that for depression, good behavioral therapy works, but it's hard to implement. SSRIs have some effect, but they're not great. It's a similar kind of thing. So this, is kind of a new area to go after with psychedelics. And so that's, we want to be kind of a trailblazer in that regard in this indication.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see ATAI pick social anxiety disorder to look at with EMP-01. I guess I'd like to ask you, what might psychological support look like with both VLS-01 and EMP-01? Will it be pretty similar, or maybe a different approach with each one?
Yeah, so VLS-01 is not going to be that dissimilar to a Compass or a BPL-03. In other words, it's what we've discussed, good preparation work, informed consent, there's no therapy per se during the exposure, and then assessing psychological safety afterwards, right? That's the key there. EMP-01 is going to be basically the same. There is no real therapy during, because it's more like a psilocybin, if you will. It seems much more internally focused. So we're not really looking for directive therapy, or non-directive therapy, I should say, during the experience, but rather, and you don't really, unlike MDMA, you don't need to keep telling the person to go back inside, right? MDMA, they want to be external. And to get benefit, you have to kind of go back inside and work on stuff internally. That seemed to be less of an issue. Now, again, I want to emphasize this was a phase 1 trial. The ends are small. We have to replicate it. But again, it was a very unique profile. And it speaks to this being very different, more psilocybin-like in that regard.
What's the duration on the rMDMA?
Yeah, it's more like psilocybin at this moment. There are some formulation approaches that we could examine to bring in the timeline. Now, it's not going to be 2 hours, but you can pull in the timeline potentially pretty substantially. We're looking into that. But certainly right now for that phase 2A study that we'll be conducting, it'll be with the oral.
Got you. With the recent FDA advisory committee's negative vote on MDMA AT for PTSD, we would like to know how ATAI feels about future investor interest in psychedelic drug development moving forward. While we think most knowledgeable healthcare investors will realize the difference between the research that was done by Lykos and other psychedelic drug development companies, we would still like to hear your views on this.
Yeah,
Certainly
I think
agree.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, you jump in.
I go first, and then
Go
can chime
for
in
it. Sorry.
as usual. Yeah, I was just about to say it's. I mean, we just discussed the idiosyncratic nature. So first of all, I agree with you. I want to say, I think they will be able to kind of tell the difference, and it's a matter of just entering into the dialogue with those healthcare investors to contextualize the outcome as well as the decision as being very idiosyncratic to Lykos and the NDA, the new drug application that they submitted. And we discussed through some of those dimensions and how we are addressing these dimensions that came up and were criticized. So I think we are fundamentally different in our approach. I think that's important to acknowledge. And that will also, and we've seen actually just shortly before The AdCom, I think there was another round also done with MindMed, right, with institutional investors. So I think there is a general awareness of the differences in how companies approach the development of those compounds and what is actually required. The FDA has been very explicit what is required, right? There's a clinical trial guideline. We see how Compass, together with the FDA, designed the phase 3 programs, and how others in the space, including ourselves, in a dialogue with the FDA, are designing these trials. So I think ultimately, while it's more of a perceived setback, I think it just needs contextualization. And it's just important to re-anchor actually on the very first approval that we saw in the space, which is Spravato. We discussed that before. 2019, they ticked all the boxes that the FDA wanted to see. And it's basically not only because kind of we like the 2-hour paradigm, but also the way that they designed the trials and got the FDA, as well as the AdCom, by the way. There was also an AdCom for esketamine and Spravato. Comfortable with the data package is basically what we will continue kind of to guide investors through, and especially show how we are also approaching it with our own trials. And I think ultimately, positive data will always help. I think there are interesting later stage data sets on the horizon from programs that we are involved in and from others. So ultimately, data is kind of key, as always in biotech, and we're very much looking forward to kind of the Q4, Q1 timeframe when it comes to additional later stage data readouts coming out.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think is also important to emphasize is, I had some concerns about their program, right? The Lykos program from the outset. There's sort of two reasons. One, we talked about the assisted therapy bit, just insofar as, that is a little strange in terms of a construction for the FDA. The other one was just trial size. So, with orphan indications and stuff, you do indeed have small trials, but PTSD is a big indication. There's a lot of patients that have PTSD, and you normally would expect large trials, right? So if you think about going back to Spravato, again, there's a large data set of patients the FDA could mine, and you now look at Compass, right? Their phase 2 trial was bigger than both Lykos phase 3 trials. And of course, the phase 3 program is about another 800 patients. So there's an important rule of thumb in clinical studies that if you want to, for example, it's the rule of 3. So if I want to find an adverse event that occurs at a 1% rate, 1 in 100, you got to test 300 patients on drug, right? So in this situation, there was about, let's say, on the order of 100 patients on drug. So adverse event rates of 3% is, you really couldn't discern anything below that. Now you can argue that it's been used a lot, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. But that's not the same as having to stick it in a drug label. That's just not the same, right? So 3% is kind of a high bar. I mean, normally you'd want to see under 1% as a typical kind of thing for a label. So you can do the math from that. If you needed for 1%, if you needed 300 on drug, and it's 1-to-1, then you need 600 patients in double-blind placebo-controlled trials, right? So that's a way to kind of think about it. That was the other piece that I was like, it's a little strange that they were able to go with such small trials. Again, I know there was a process here. It was a complex process. This went on. This is 2 decades in the making, right? This IND went in 2021. The world has changed. 2001. The world has certainly changed in the intervening period. So unfortunately, they were kind of caught and swept up in that.
Thank you, Srini and Florian.
So what are some upcoming catalysts for ATAI that people should look out for throughout the rest of this year?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that are ongoing. So in terms of the internal programs, we're really excited to get the phase 2 trials initiated for VLS-01 and EMP-01. So that's going to be big for us. Very excited about that. Expecting to initiate the phase 1 trial on IBX-210 as well. In terms of programs that were associated with COMP360, obviously looking forward to seeing that phase 3 result. That's going to be big. It's important, it's important for the industry, as Florian indicated as well. I think there's going to be a lot of eyes on that. And then, wrapping up the BPL-003 phase 2b, I think that's going to be very important as a milestone for us. And then, of course, there's some additional data that's coming out around ELE 101 as well, with the phase 2a data that I alluded to, open label phase 2a data in depression, as well as some additional data that's going to be coming out with BPL-003 in alcohol use disorder. So different indication, clearly, but should be very interesting data. So that's all over the course of the next, not even 4 months. So that's going to be busy. And then, of course, as we go into next year, lots of things happening, right? So our RL-007 readout, we're guiding VLS-01 and EMP-01 as around the end of next year, multiple phase 1 trial readouts as well. So, and of course, again, Compass, their second phase 3 readout will be next year, in the middle of next year as well. So again, lots going on.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. So that's the interview for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I wanted to thank Srini and Florian for joining us, and Jake, thank you for being a part of this. I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and thanks again.